In the middle of the marketplace, they had set up a wooden platform. But today, they were not selling horses, and they were not selling guns. They were selling Malaya, the giant Comanche girl, her body muscular like a living statue, towering over all the men standing around her. Her father stood beside her. Her mother covered her face. They shouted like they were auctioning off an animal. This girl, she cannot bear children like a normal woman. Whoever can pay, take her. We can no longer afford to feed this useless thing. The men laughed loudly. One of them tapped the handle of his rifle against Malaya's firm arm and burst out mockingly, "Look at this. Is this a woman or a raging bull?" Malaya bowed her head. She did not cry, but her eyes were as empty and cold as stone. From the corner of the market, Ronan Hale stood still, a widowed rancher, his face gray with fury. He stared at Malaya for a long time, not because of her body but because of the loneliness in her eyes, exactly like his own. He stepped forward, placed the money down. The entire market fell silent. Ronan spoke slowly, each word sharp like falling gravel. "I do not need someone to bear children. I need you." No one dared to laugh anymore. Malaya looked up at him, as if it were the first time someone had seen past her body. That night, Ronan took her away from the market, not as a piece of property that had been bought, but as a person, finally chosen. Dust Creek Ranch sat halfway up the Yellowstone Hill. At night, the wind whistled through every crack in the wooden planks, like the sighs of ghosts buried deep underground. When Ronan brought Malaya home to the yard, the cabin door opened. An older woman with a long, narrow face and eyes sharp as blades stood there. She was the mother of Ronan's late wife. That woman had never forgiven the death of her daughter. She looked Malaya up and down, her gaze cold as ice. "So, another shadow has stepped into this house?" Ronan said nothing. He simply handed Malaya an old leather coat with worn shoulders, the one that had belonged to his late wife, and placed a block of warmed saltstone on the chair next to the fireplace. Then he said gently, "It is a cold night. Keep it at the foot of your bed." He did not touch her. He did not ask for anything. He did not take advantage of the woman who had just endured the shame of being sold in the marketplace. Men of the West often bought women just to own them, but Ronan gave her something many men never knew how to give: respect. Malaya stayed quiet. For the first time in her life, someone did not treat her muscular body as a joke or a commodity to be used. That night, she lay on the old wooden bed, her feet resting on the warm saltstone, the firelight flickering through the cracks in the old cabin walls. Outside, the wind howled as if trying to tear the whole mountain range apart. But inside Malaya's heart, she felt something she had never known since childhood, a sense of safety. In the kitchen, Ronan sat still at the wooden table, turning a cup of cold coffee between his hands. His former mother-in-law walked in, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You think you bought yourself a real woman? That thing will never be someone's wife." Ronan replied quietly, "You do not know her, and you do not know me anymore." She shook her head and left the room, the slam of the door behind her filled with bitterness. Outside the window, light snow began to fall through the night, each flake landing on the roof like the sound of metal touching metal. But with every snowflake falling, this ranch, which had been as silent as a grave, had just taken a new breath. Malaya closed her eyes. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. This was the first night in her life she slept without curling up to protect herself. She did not need anyone's pity. She did not need anyone's sorrow. All she needed was a place to lie down like a real human being. And Dust Creek Ranch, on that night, began to change the fate of two souls once cast into the dark. Malaya was not someone who could sit still. At the break of dawn the next morning, she was already hauling water from the well, chopping firewood, and fixing up the broken fence that had been rotting away for who knows how long. Ronan's former mother-in-law stood on the porch, watching, a mocking smirk on her face. A body like a man's. What else could it be good for? Besides hard labor? Malaya said nothing. She was far too used to those kinds of words. Out here in the West, people were quicker to judge a woman by her womb or her figure than by her heart. But 3 days later, the whole ranch came to see that Malaya was not just brute strength. She had discipline. She had willpower. She had endurance like the desert stone. She cleaned out the old barn in the western corner, the one that still held memories from Ronan's late wife. Every layer of dust, every dried bloodstain from years past, she scrubbed clean. She built racks, laid down fresh straw mats, and made it a space protected from the wind. She did not ask Ronan. She did not wait for permission. By evening, Ronan came out to take a look. He stood at the barn door, watching her wipe the last of the windows. "What are you planning to do with this place?" he asked. Malaya answered in a calm, matter-of-fact voice. She was not trying to sound noble. "This place will be for women who have been cast out of their homes. Like I was. For those who have no shelter. Out here in the West, there are many of us." Ronan looked at her for a long time, with eyes that, for the first time, did not see a woman with pity, but with recognition. That night, without saying a word, Ronan picked up a hammer, a few new wooden planks, and mounted a small pine sign onto the main cabin wall. Hand-carved letters read, "Malaya Hale, co-owner." Malaya stood there, stunned, truly stunned. They were not husband and wife, and she was definitely not a servant. She was now a co-owner of this land. Ronan's former mother-in-law, upon seeing the sign, hurled a cup to the kitchen floor. It shattered into pieces. She could not stand the fact that a giant girl had been placed on equal footing with the Hale name, but Ronan did not care. He stepped out into the yard, eyes fixed on the newly cleaned barn. Malaya followed a few steps behind and stood beside him without a word. They stood close. When the night wind swept down from Granite Ridge, it carried the scent of fresh earth, of grass returning to life in the early cold season, and it told them both that this was not a story of rescuer and rescued. This was the story of two souls, beginning to rebuild their lives from the smallest bricks. News traveled faster than the wind across Dust Creek. From the Bitter Mesa Saloon to the small chapel in the Stone Valley, people had begun to whisper. Ronan Hale brought the giant woman back to the ranch. The drinking men roared with laughter, while the gossiping women murmured behind Malaya's back. "That is what they call a woman?" The Hale folks must have lost their minds. But Malaya was not bothered. She just quietly kept working. She repaired everything from the roof of the cattle shed to the rusted lock on the storage room door. She taught a few poor women in the area who came early in the morning how to handle a gun, swing an axe, and pitch a tent in a windstorm. No arguments. She proved everything with action. One afternoon, a group of men on horseback showed up at the ranch gate. They laughed, whistled, and hollered at Malaya like she was an animal. "Hey, giant girl, what are you doing with that widower? Come back to town, be our entertainment, it pays better." Malaya did not take a single step outside the fence. She did not curse once. She just looked the leader dead in the eye, so cold and calm that it made his skin crawl. Ronan, watching from the barn, did not rush out like some hot-headed man might. He let Malaya handle it. He trusted her. Malaya spoke slowly. Every word, heavy as stone. "I do not need to prove my worth to those who have never had a heart." For a brief moment, the men fell silent, then turned their horses and rode off. Not because they were afraid of her muscles, but because, in her eyes, there was no fear left. And a person who no longer fears cannot be controlled. That night, under the soft glow of the oil lamp, Ronan hammered the last nail into the wooden rack she had built, then said quietly, "I see what you are doing. I will not stand in your way. Keep going." Malaya placed her large but warm hand on the cabin beam, her voice carrying the honesty of something ancient in this land. "I did not come here for pity. I came to become what I was always meant to be." Ronan looked at her in the firelight, her arms like they had been carved from the granite of Ridge Mountain, but her eyes, soft, like a soul that had once been torn open. "I am truly grateful that you are here with me. Let us know where you are listening from. And if this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel to support me. I only wish you peace and happiness, wherever you are listening to this. On an early morning in mid-May, the sky over Dust Creek was veiled in mist, like it had been brushed with a layer of silver. Dr. Harrison Old, with a slight limp, came to the ranch to check on the war wound in Ronan's shoulder. As he passed by Malaya, he stopped in his tracks and looked at her for a long time, not with the suspicion the townsfolk usually carried, but with the eyes of someone who had seen many kinds of bodies in his lifetime. "I want to ask you something," he said. Has anyone ever done a regular fertility examination for you? Malaya froze. Since childhood, she had been judged, labeled her large body deemed incapable of bearing children. That belief had hardened like shackles. Harrison asked her to sit down. He examined her thoroughly, carefully, slowly, precisely. When he removed his gloves, he spoke just one sentence. You can have children like any other woman. People just assumed the wrong thing. That sentence fell like a stone into a deep well. Malaya did not cry. She stood there, frozen. Those words, they were a release from chains she had worn for years. What had imprisoned her was not her body. It was the sentence others had placed on her. Ronan stood nearby, looking at her for a long time. Then he said something soft, but it reached deep into her bones. But you do not need to bear children to be worthy of being human. Malaya turned to look at him, and in her eyes was no longer the gaze of someone merely surviving. It was the gaze of someone beginning to choose her own future. That night, they lit a fire in the yard beside the barn. The women who had come to the newly built bunkhouse sat around, some abandoned by their husbands, some driven out by their towns, a few children who had lost their mothers. All of them looked at Malaya no longer as someone different, but as a pillar of stone, one that had stood through centuries of wind and never fallen. Malaya told them what she had learned that afternoon. No one cheered. No one screamed with joy. They just sat closer as if they, too, had just had an invisible chain around their necks unlocked. A black woman, her voice trembling, said, "We are not mistakes of creation. We were just controlled by people who used pain to keep us down." Malaya nodded. That night, they sat together until the last coal turned to ash. Ronan walked into the barn and hung a second lantern, not to light the path, but to signal that this ranch was big enough for new lives coming in. And from the moment Harrison spoke those words, Malaya was no longer the one who had been rejected. She became the one who defined her own worth. Miracles do not come from a womb. Miracles begin the moment we no longer let others decide who we are meant to be. The news that Malaya could bear children spread like wildfire through dry grass. No one knew who started it, but within just 3 days the past came knocking. That evening, as the sunset bled red across Dust Creek, a group of riders stopped at the ranch gate. They were not merchants, not wandering miners. They were Malaya's birth parents, along with 4 of the men who had stood at the auction that day. They looked at her with eyes full of greed, regret, and bitterness all at once. Her father spoke first, smug and arrogant. "People say you can bear children now. That makes you valuable again. I've come to take you back." Malaya stood still, but her hands clenched so tightly, the tendons stood out like ropes pulled taut in the wind. Ronan stepped out from the barn and placed himself just 1 step in front of Malaya. He did not shout, did not threaten, did not raise a gun. He just spoke calmly. "At Dust Creek Ranch, no one gets sold a second time." The man who had touched Malaya's arm during the auction sneered. "This widowed rancher thinks he's got the right to talk law?" Malaya stepped forward half a pace, her voice low, steady, no longer trembling like in the past. "I did not come back to let anyone decide who I am anymore." The man glared at her. "Your body is big, so what's it for, if not for men to use?" That sentence was the final knife, meant to stab into the years she had spent trapped in shame. Ronan slowly drew his gun, and right then, the sheriff whom Ronan had quietly written to the day before appeared from over the hill. He walked up without hesitation. "I heard about kidnapping, trafficking, selling people. That time is over in these parts." Malaya's father exhaled heavily, then looked at her and spoke his last words. "If you won't come back, don't call me father." Malaya stared straight into those eyes, and for the first time in her life, did not look away. "I was never your daughter. We end here." There were no shouts, no punches, no gunshots, only release. The sheriff handcuffed 2 of the men who had trafficked women in another town. Malaya's parents were ordered to leave Wyoming with no right to return under charges of human trafficking and forced labor. As the evening dust storm blew strong, sending the group over the ridge and out of sight, Ronan placed his hand on Malaya's shoulder, not to comfort her, but as a sign that he saw she had stood tall on her own. Malaya exhaled like the final breath of a bird, freed from a steel cage after years. "I have buried them myself," she said softly. Ronan replied, "Yes, they no longer hold your soul." And that evening, for the first time, Dust Creek Ranch belonged to the living, truly. No one really noticed when winter melted away. The snow pulled back from the valley. The ground soaked up the moisture, soft and rich, and the smell of green grass began to rise like an apology from the earth after a season of brutality. Every morning, Malaya would slowly open the barn doors and stand still, staring at the stretch of land before her, the same land where she once felt like nothing more than discarded trash, now transformed into a place where people came to live. Most of the women who had once taken shelter at the ranch stayed after the storm had passed. They built chicken coops, planted beans, worked the soil, dug irrigation trenches, patched the roof. They no longer called the place Hale Ranch. They called it Dust Creek Haven, a safe refuge in the cruel West. The afternoons grew quieter. Malaya was no longer a shadow with a bowed head. She smiled more, though still spoke little. Children at the ranch ran around her feet without fear of her size anymore. A 6-year-old black girl once hugged her arm and asked, "Miss Malaya, do muscles like this hurt?" Malaya remembered that moment clearly. She knelt down so their eyes were level, smiled, and said, "No, they help me protect those who are small." And the little girl hugged her like she was a breathing wall. Ronan spent less and less time drinking hot coffee alone. He stood beside Malaya more often. Sometimes they said nothing all morning, just leaned against the fence, watching the cattle stroll slowly toward the stream. One afternoon, as sunlight poured golden like honey over the distant mountains, Ronan handed Malaya an old leather-bound ledger. "I want you to write your name on the first page," he said. "Not as a guest, not as something I once bought, but as someone who has a rightful place here." Malaya opened to the first page. She did not write her name the way women in this land usually did. She wrote it firm, sure, bold, like it was carved in stone. Malaya Hale, not out of marriage, not out of ownership, but out of choice. That evening, they sat together on the wooden steps of the porch. The spring wind blew soft and slow. Ronan stared straight ahead and said just one quiet sentence. "If you want, this could be our new life." Malaya did not answer with words. She simply placed her hand over his, a hand large, rough, scarred, but for the first time in her life. It was not a hand made only to endure. It became a hand that wanted to build something new. And in that spring, Dust Creek Haven was no longer a place for two lost souls. It became the beginning of a new family. That summer arrived quietly, not harsh. It came like a fresh breath, laid gently across fields once cracked like stone. Dust Creek Haven now had workers, had laughter, had the sound of children in the morning, the sound of men fixing rooftops, the sound of women grinding corn, and for the first time in many months, the soft hum of someone singing at dusk. One early morning, Malaya paused as she carried a bucket of water. Her body trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from a feeling she had never known before. She placed her hand on her stomach. That feeling, it was unlike any wound she had ever endured. It was not pain. It was life. Dr. Harrison came to check on her. He smiled gently and slowly said, "You are pregnant, and the baby is healthy." Ronan stood still. He did not laugh or cheer. He simply looked at her, with the eyes of a man who once believed that God had closed every door for him. Malaya stepped closer, placed her hand on his. "This is not a prize for the victor. This is a gift for those brave enough to stay." Ronan gripped her hand tighter. In the following weeks, the women on the ranch helped Malaya prepare a handmade cradle carved from cypress wood. White women, black women, native women, none of them asked what blood the child carried. They called the baby by one name only: Hope. One late season afternoon, Ronan carved a new line into the wooden gate at the ranch entrance. Not from blood, from love. From choice. Not from blood, but from love, and from choice. As the sun sank behind Dust Creek, Ronan and Malaya sat on the porch, watching the cattle move slowly toward the distant stream. There was no need to speak anymore. They knew this was more than a ranch. It was not a shelter. It was not an escape from pain. It was a beginning, a home that brought broken souls back to life in the heart of the West. And the child growing inside Malaya was the clearest proof that what the world once called impossible sometimes only needed a hand laid gently at the right moment to become something that will happen. This harsh West might wear down many things, but it cannot kill the will to stay for one another. Dear friends, Social judgment is nothing more than a frame people try to force upon another human being, but the true worth of a person is never in the eyes of the crowd. It lies in how we live, how we treat others, and how we choose to stay, even when life tries to bury us. No one has the right to decide your worth. But you. Live kindly, live true to the part of your soul that still believes, and that alone is enough to outlast every label the world tries to pin on you. It has been my honor to share this story with you. Please take care of yourselves, and try to stay joyful and healthy. I truly mean that, and I truly appreciate you, the wonderful audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know how this story made you feel. Leave a comment below, and if you liked the story, press the number 8. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel to support me. I love you all.